And what he found was fascinating, that what happens first is the start of the activity in the brain. And then really only 200 milliseconds, and very shortly before the action, is the time when you think you've decided to act. In other words, the brain's started being ready to move before you make the decision that you're going to move. Now, this makes perfect sense in biological terms. It's perfectly ordinary result in a way. And the world crashed down upon him, endless philosophical arguments, endless neuroscientific arguments. He said something along the lines of, in the end, I let the decision make itself. And that was a certain freedom, and it was all fine. And it is, in Zen terms, it's often described as let the universe do it, or let the practice do it. You have to find something else to blame. And blaming the practice of meditation is quite innocuous compared with blaming an inner self who has magical powers to control everything.
Everyone, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. I really hope you're enjoying this second series as much as I am. And if you are, I would be extremely grateful if you can help me spread the word by sharing these shows, rating them, and maybe even reviewing us on iTunes podcast if you're an iTunes person. So today we have the tough job of evaluating the evidence for the existence of free will. Now, as you know, the debate has raged for centuries in philosophy. But now, with advances in neuroscience and psychology experiments, we may have some actual physical evidence to argue over. Now, we're also going to be getting into meditation and Zen, as it seems that those who use some kind of mindfulness meditation, and hence they're used to watching the way their thoughts arise and pass without actually identifying with them, they seem to be much less troubled by the idea that they may not have free will. So who better to explain this mind-boggling question than our first returning guest, psychologist, author, and visiting professor at Plymouth University, Susan Blackmore. She's best known for her books The Meme Machine, Zen and the Art of Consciousness, Consciousness and Introduction, and Seeing Myself. And her work spans across hundreds of different publications in over 20 different languages, making great contributions in the fields of psychology, memetics, religion, philosophy of mind, supernatural experience, and many other areas. Now, this problem has troubled me since I first started questioning it while studying philosophy, so I really can't wait to get into this with someone who's been wrestling at with this problem at the highest level of academia for over 20 years. So without further ado, let's go. Sue Blackmore, welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for joining us a second time.
You're very welcome.
Straight back from a Zen retreat. How does it feel to come off straight out of a Zen retreat into talking about, important philosophical stuff? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage, I wonder?
We'll see. But it's been a few days. I got back on Saturday evening. And it carries on after the retreat, and insights kind of come. People often say this, you work away, day after day, sitting, and some things shift and so on. But actually, it's afterwards, the shifts go on, and I'm still in that kind of shifting in the way I'm seeing the world, which is rather interesting.
I'm rather looking forward to getting your reflections while you're still in that sort of very, very clear, detached state. I'm very curious. So Sue has been on the show already, and as a result, well, first of all, listeners, you must go back to the first episode and hear Sue's extraordinary rendition of her out-of-body experience, now famous out-of-body experience, and her insight into the hard problem of consciousness. But because of that, Sue, you've already answered my usual first question about formative influences. So I wanted to ask you something a bit differently, mostly because I know you love these mind games. I've been perambulating recently a lot about maturity and how radically we can change our approach to certain things as we get older. So I'd like you to ask you this. Can you choose one of those first memorable, formative, big questions from those intense teenage years that really gripped you and try and compare how you thought about it then to how you thought about it now?
Yeah. If I strictly take the teenage years, I did wonder about patterns and why birds were flying in a V shape, and was there some strange patterning going on in the world? It turns out there isn't. I mean, not in that sense at any rate. We know exactly why they fly in V formations now, which is a mixture of physics and how their brains work. But I think this is probably 20, so I hope that will count. I became obsessed with the question of memory. How does memory work? In a way now, I would think of it as a question to do with consciousness, which I didn't really think about then. And you were not allowed to talk about consciousness. We're talking 1970, 71-ish. Consciousness was not mentioned in a psychology degree in those days. So it's perhaps not surprising I didn't think about it that way. But I can remember standing outside the psychology department in Oxford and thinking, I remember this place. I remember going in there yesterday. How does a brain do that? What's going on? What is memory? And I was making up all these theories about memory being outside of the brain, psychic kind of theories, because I was really into all that psychic stuff. As you know, after the out-of-body experience, I believed all these things. So I had all these kind of psychic theories. And the actual science that was going on then was rubbish. There was talk about chopping up planarian worms and that memory was stored in RNA, and that the molecules were storing the information, which is obviously crazy because you couldn't get the information out fast enough. I can ask you, what's the number of your house? Well, you're very slow, but what's the capital of France?
Yeah,
you haven't got a brain at all. You've got RNA working in there.
I've got no memory. I even lived there.
How old are you?
44.
That was a bit quicker. The point is, those theories were kind of impossible to work, and they didn't have better theories. And so I was really getting carried away with memory is out there, and all our memories are shared. And ESP is really only a special case of the more general concepts of memory. And the other way around. Our private memories are a special case of the general availability of all it. I mean, that was equally crap but that was my obsession. And I nearly did took a PhD place to study memory at Sussex University, and I turned it down because I wanted to prove the paranormal was true. And so that was obsession. Now we have a really good idea, and there's so much more to learn, but we really understand about dendritic growth and how the connections between neurons synaptic strength is altered, and the fascinating mixture of digital analog processes going on in brains. And it's making sense now. So
it's definitely a full conversation. It's definitely something we're going to have to look into on Chasing Consciousness to be complete in our work. So it's going to be a whole show on the different theories of memory.
Something. You're never going to be complete.
That I can imagine.
Just so as you know. Okay, yeah. What next are you going to tempt me with?
Right, straight to the big ones. Free will. The argument has, of course, raged for centuries in philosophy, but rather than get into those conceptual arguments, which are human mental constructs, let's go to the more recent experiments in psychology and neuroscience that, in your opinion, give us physical proof that free will is an illusion. I think Libet is probably the best place to start, right? Poor fellow. He actually set out to prove that free will was real, didn't he?
He did. I'm shaking my head because I don't think there's any proof, and I'm not going to claim there's any proof that there's no free will.
So that's too strong a word.
Yes, exactly. I mean, just to set it up, you mentioned that it's been going on a long time. I mean, I love it. Samuel Johnson in the 18th century said something like, all theory is against freedom of the will, all experience is for it. Now, he didn't have any neuroscience. He was just looking at the world, as you might with dependent origination, you mentioned. But, you can look at the world and see how it operates and think there can't be free will. And he could do that 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago. now we have so much neuroscience and so much more evidence. The problem is, yes, there can't be free will, but people still go on believing in it against all the odds. And I can't prove it because of that, because they'll always come up with, yes, but what about my experience? Anyway, Libet. So Libet, a lovely man. I've met him a couple of times. I had a wonderful walk with him in San Francisco near the Golden Gate Bridge. And we were walking along this road, and there was a little kid further up the pavement. And he said something like, to give you an example of what he believes about it, he said, the experiments may show that I can't, I'm not free to think what to do, but I can stop myself doing things. For example, if I had an impulse to want to go and murder that little girl, if I was a wicked person, a murderer, but I could stop myself. And that's the important part of free will. So he was kind of hedging his bets at that point. But why I say it was lovely conversations with him is because he really cared about it, And so he did these experiments, as you point out, because he was trying to prove that there was free will. And I expect most of your listeners will know his experiments, but very briefly, we're talking them early to mid-80s. And what he did was he asked people to do a simple action, which was whenever they wanted to, of their own free will, spontaneously, deliberately, to flex their wrist. They didn't have a choice about what to do. They only had a choice about when to do it. But that's all he could do because he didn't have brain scans. He only had EEG. So he had EEG on the head to look at the motor strip when the action would start there. The readiness potential will start. So you have a readiness potential. It's a kind of, if you imagine a graph, it's like building up, and then the action happens. And that can go up to a second before the action takes place. So he measured the time of that happening in the brain. He measured with an electrode on the wrist the time of the movement. And then he had to try and measure when the person made the decision to move. Now, that's why his experiments are, I would say, still the most famous experiments ever done on consciousness. The way he measured it was very clever. He had a spot revolving on a screen, and he asked people to shout out or to say where the spot was when they decided to act. And what's critical about this method is, it's no good pressing a lever or something, because that takes a lag the same way as the lag that's going on in the movement. But this way you report it after the fact. So the spot's going round, you make your movement, and afterwards you say, oh, I decided when the spot was at 4 or 6 or 9 or whatever it was. So I often in lectures have had, I got 100 or however many people sitting there and all going like this. And I ask them to shout out, and I'll go like this and I'll be the spot. And then I say, shout out where it was when you decided. And they, you go, here, 12, 1, 5, 7, people can do it. One of the philosophical objections is they can't do it. They can do it, do it easily. And what he found was fascinating, that what happens first is the start of the activity in the brain. And then really only 200 milliseconds, and very shortly before the action, is the time when you think you've decided to act. In other words, the brain's started being ready to move before you make the decision that you're going to move. Now, this makes perfect sense in biological terms. It's perfectly ordinary result in a way, and the world crashed down upon him, endless philosophical arguments, endless neuroscientific arguments, and I'm not going to go into any of them. There's plenty, there's hundreds and hundreds of articles and many books all about that one experiment.
Still some pretty compelling evidence for a starting point, wasn't it? And did it convince Libet? Yes. Did he change his mind?
No, because he said that you could actually veto. So he did some other experiments, which I'll take too much time if I go into explaining how they work. But they indicated that although you couldn't initiate the action with your free will, you could just in time stop it. In that 200 milliseconds bit, you could just in time stop it happening. So there's your free will, which is why we had this conversation about walking along the street.
And that comes on to the next bit of relevant research from Daniel Wegner at Harvard a bit later with his thought suppression experiments, because this is kind of what Libet's talking about. It's the ability to suppress the impulse to do something, right?
Freddie, I want you for the next couple of minutes, please, not to think about a white bear at all. You mustn't think about a white bear, okay?
Easy. Now, no problem. No white bears in here, mate.
Okay, no white bears there. So while we're talking, if by any chance you should think about a white bear, just go, will you tell me? Okay, but you're not going to, are you? Because you're really, really good at thought suppression. So what Libet did was he discovered that it's really, really, really hard not to think about something I'm not going to mention.
I just thought about it, by the way,
yeah. yeah, right. You're like everybody. And that was one of his early experiments. But what excites me about Wegner is his basic theory, which is very straightforward, that people attribute. Sorry, I'm stopping here because it's really reminding me of the retreat I've just been on.
Well, and please feel free, Sue, to bring it in. Bring it in. It's a synchronicity.
About that later. Let me try and be clear about Wegner first, though. So he says that the way you decide whether you have done something or somebody else has done it involves the timing. So if you have a thought, for example, I'm going to have a drink of wine, and all you people, it is 6 o'clock in the evening, and I'm allowed my glass of wine now. So if you have a thought, I'm going to have a glass of wine, and then the hand reaches out and actually takes the glass, the appropriate amount of time later, you will attribute that to yourself. I did it. Whereas if you reached out your hand before you thought about it, well, of course, that does happen, doesn't it? But that's the general principle. And to find out whether that was true, he did a whole series of experiments where he could alter the time by putting thoughts into people's heads and making them move things. He could alter the time gap, and he showed that this is so, that we do judge whether we did something ourselves according to the appropriate time lag between a thought about doing the thing and the thing happening.
Wow, and that's a brilliant way to test it. Clever.
Yeah, and the experiments themselves were fascinating. So his theory is that what happens is that we attribute things to ourselves. So it's the same thing as mixing up correlation and cause. Now, I'm sure you know that it's a problem in every science. You get a correlation between A and B. Let's say something really stupid like children who eat ketchup do worse in their exams or something like that. You know, one explanation would be ketchup poisons your brain and makes you do bad. Another one would be if you do badly in your exams, you go and eat some chips and pour lots of ketchup on them to cheer you up. Or it could be that both are caused by something completely different, which of course in that case would probably be poverty or something to do with your home life or whatever. But the general principle is absolutely there. You have a correlation. You can't know what the cause is. You've got to do further experiments to find out. Now, he said in the case of free will, what happens is we do the correlation and cause mistake. We see the correlation between, I had that thought, and a moment later it happened and I had the wine. And we therefore conclude that my thought caused the drinking of the wine. But it didn't at all. Underlying brain processes already brewing up and going, and whatever they're doing, caused, as is compatible with Libet's experiment, of course, caused both the thought and the action. And the thought was quicker to cause because it doesn't take so much bits of brain. The action has to go, has to have the preparation in premotor cortex and get to them. That's why the readiness potential can take quite a long time. And so one comes after the other. But the thought doesn't cause the action. And this is a kind of very, very basic, simple underlying foundation for a lot of free will. Probably not all of the free will works that way. But that's why he said free will is an illusion. And I agree with him.
Mm. But the question that me and I presume all the listeners are asking now is who or what is making our decisions if not our free will?
Right. Well, here again, I'm thinking about the retreat and the 40 years of meditation. Who or what? This is the whole thing. I think, to me, and I've argued endlessly with Dan Dennett about this.
Yeah, I hoped you'd mention that, because I'm curious to know where you differ.
Big time on this issue. But God, I've even forgotten what I was supposed to be answering now. We've gone off it.
Well, the big question is,
who does it? Yes.
Or what, if it's not our conscious, thoughtful mind, if it's not the prefrontal lobe, who is making the decision?
Yeah. I think we need to discriminate very clearly between the person, the whole physical thing, this thing here, this biological creature, and the illusory self that seems to be inside and doing it. And the whole point about free will, to me, if I ask an audience of people or my friends or whatever, what's free will, the way they talk about it is like that. It's I, it's me, it's this me who's in here looking out through my eyes. That's the one who has the free will. And yes, I can tell my body I can tell my arms to move, but you can't tell your arms to move. Wegner has just given one way of explaining why not. But if you think about the brain as an amazingly complex, billions of neurons with trillions of connections, all doing their jobs. In terms, I don't know why I've chosen the why. I'll pick up my pen instead. Otherwise, I'll drink too much. Think of all the different areas of the brain that are involved in that. And if I start to write something down, that's going to involve masses of stuff. This supposedly conscious entity, do not know about any of that, frankly. And I certainly don't know what's going on in my digestive system. And frankly, look, I'm moving my hands. That's not me, some conscious little entity in here moving the hand. That hand is connected through all of this stuff, cerebellum and all sorts, to be doing these clever movements and moving. Look, I can move the pen like this.
What about something more complex, like an impulse suppression with an ethical implication? For example, I want to have my third whiskey, but I suddenly think, actually, that's probably going to be, showing me up as exaggerating a little, and I choose not to for health reasons, or to not upset my loved ones or something. There's an ethical component there. Is the suggestion that the brain itself, in that complexity you just described, this vast amount of unconscious activity that's taking place all the time, has an ethical dimension? Because presumably that is possible.
Well, you're dividing processing into conscious and unconscious, which is something I think also has to be thrown out. But we can
unwise, yeah.
That. Yeah, I will avoid putting it that way. But what I would say is, people very often say, well, it's all right after Libet and Wegner and, whatever. It's all right for simple things like moving your hand, but it doesn't apply to, shall I accept this marriage proposal? Do I want that job or that job? Oh, should I spend this much money on this thing? Or, whatever complicated, or as you say, ethical and moral decisions, like I'll have the third glass of whiskey. Why should they be any different? They take longer, they're slower, they're more complex. I do remember I have been trying personally to give up living with free will for 50 years. I can remember when my boyfriend, John Dupre, he's now a philosophy professor at Exeter. He was doing his undergraduate thesis on weakness of the will. And so this is a long time ago. So we had wonderful arguments about free will. And at that time, I had to make, so it wasn't with him, but I'd been having all these arguments. And I had to make a very difficult decision about my life and my kids. And it was really hard. And I thought to myself, well, I'd think about all the advantages and disadvantages. And then I thought, that's just what this brain and body in this world does. It makes lists of advantages and disadvantages. It's not done by free will. It's done by clever brain that's been brought up to think sensibly, and it can do this, and it will do it with or without free will. So I sat down with a piece of paper and I wrote, advantages, disadvantages of doing what it was, and made the decision. And I think it's very natural to say, well, I made the decision, but then you're back into inventing this non-existent self who lives in the brain, because how could there be such a thing in there?
We do talk about this, listeners. In episode 1, we look into the illusion of the self with Sue, and I think that there's a lot to think about there. So I think the two are very, very much connected. So we're going to come back.
Can I just stop you?
Sure.
When you use the word illusion, the way I use the word illusion, because I got so many people saying, well, you just don't believe there's such a thing. And I'm not saying that. So we'll look it up in the dictionary. What's an illusion? It's something that is not the way it appears to be. Something that's not what you think it is. So it's just that you make a mistake. It's not that there's nothing. It's not that there isn't a problem of consciousness. It's not that there isn't a problem of free will. There are actions and choices and so on. But I call it an illusion because it's not the magic it seems to be. It is not some, spiritual thing inside that is kind of manipulating the synapses. It wouldn't make sense. But it's not that there's nothing. It's not that there's no sense of self. There's a sense of self. The brain is constructing an idea. It's constructing a body schema, all of, this. And it's monitoring the things that the mouth says, and it's doing all that stuff. But it's not a little magical self with consciousness and free will. That's what I mean by illusion.
And that kind of understanding where there's a sort of two-tiered approach, we're going to come back to, because there are a lot of people who, like you, accept that free will is an illusion and yet go ahead and do that in the but I want to quickly quickly want to cover another couple of things before we come back to that, Sue. And the first, and I think probably the most important to represent, is those who argue against these arguments from Libet, from Wegner, from yourselves, from Sam Harris, who are some of the most sort of vociferous, argue for this most vociferously, but at the same time, there's also experimental evidence from Libet and Wegner. Tell me, what are the main arguments? I mean, you mentioned before, experience itself, the sensation, the feeling that I have it, is presumably the strongest.
I think it is for many people. That is the strongest, and it is very powerful. I still get it occasionally, and then I look at it and go, oh, there's that sensation of free will. But it's very much the same with self. Yes, the brain is building a representation of a self that is doing the controlling, and it isn't true. And that's the way to look at it. So one kind of argument is simply, well, I know I've got free will. And you get that quite a lot. I know I've got free will. Then you have got Dennett's arguments, which I think perhaps we ought to tackle, reluctant as I feel in some ways to do so. But
to represent him when you've been arguing
exactly.
for so
long. I don't want
long.
to be unfair, but I would like to mention, I did a book called Conversations on Consciousness, in which I interviewed about 20 of what were then, this is some years ago now, the top researchers in consciousness, including Wegner and Dennett and all sorts of people, many that you've had on your show, and will have, I gather. And I asked them all the same questions, or a few of the same questions with lots of other stuff. And one of those questions was, do you have free will? I didn't ask them, most of them, do you believe in free will? I just said, do you have it? And what was so interesting was all these super intelligent, amazingly clever, well-researched, theoretically wonderful kind of people. Only a couple of people in there said no. And I found that quite disturbing. And the majority said, yes, I've got free will. And of those who said anything like, well, I'm not sure, there was a lot of, well, but I have to believe, I have to act as if I have free will.
Patricia Churchland's a good example of this, isn't it?
She has extreme identity type theory of consciousness, very much reductionist, and I follow her in a lot of it. But I was kind of amazed that she would say you have to live as if free will. But in a way, I understand this fully, because actually throwing off the sensation of free will, really throwing it off is not, I'm still in the process. I keep thinking, yeah, I've got rid of free will, and then discovering new depths of the sort of feeling that it can throw up. So I do understand that. But interestingly, one of the people involved was Dan Wegner, and he said, I have to live as if free will. And I pushed him, and he ended up saying something like, and it was quite heartfelt at the time, the way he was speaking, that he had to make a very difficult family decision that would affect other people, and it was very difficult. And that in the end, honestly, people can go and read this in the book and say that I've got it wrong. So I guess it's like a long time ago. But my recollection is he said something along the lines of, in the end, I let the decision make itself. And that was a certain freedom, and it was all fine. Mm. And it is, in Zen terms, it's often described as let the universe do it, or let the practice do it. You have to find something else to blame. And blaming the practice of meditation is quite innocuous compared with blaming an inner self who has magical powers to control everything.
But there are more powerful reasons, aren't there? Dennet and Churchland give some quite important institutional, sort of society-based arguments for why we should go ahead as if.
Yes. To some extent, I'm with them, because you can't all at once give up free will and still behave well. And this may be one of the reasons why there's always these ethical stuff that you're supposed to do before you get into a meditation, which I'm not a Buddhist, so I'm not done all that taking vows, and I'm not going to do that. But I can understand why it might be necessary. I think our upbringing in a civilized society should.
What are they worried about? What are they worried about? Why is it so important?
What are they worried about is the whole of the legal system breaking down and people running amok. There's lots of reasons why people don't run amok and go and run over old ladies in the road, which is one example I remember from a favorite book of mine by Guy Claxton. And we don't run amok and run over old ladies in the road for fun, because we are, we're a social species. We have reciprocal altruism. All sorts of biological reasons why we will, on the whole, tend to behave well, because it will in the end suit us. But the legal question is very difficult. And in the end, I think that for, you mentioned Pat and Dan, for Dan, in the end, this is the reason. And I think it's a very, 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 very bad reason. What would happen to our legal systems if, and I'll just talk about England because I know English law better than American or other laws, but what would happen to it if we were to say, right, nobody has free will. That awful 17-year-old thug who went and beat up the other gang member or whatever didn't do it of his own free will. Well, why did he do it? He did it because of his upbringing. He did it because his genes were this way, all the memes he'd taken in from all this gang warfare and everything else. His parents were probably in some desperate state as well and not able to bring him up to have a clear understanding of what are the consequences of his actions. Any number of reasons. Now, would then society fall apart? No. Okay, we need to punish him. Why? Okay, let's say we think that 5 years in prison would be the right punishment. Our reasoning would not be because he's a bad person and of his own free will did something wicked. Our reason would be either he's so dangerous we need to take him off the streets for a while and try and help rehabilitate him, or it will be an incentive for him not to do it again, or it will be an incentive to other people not to do it. Now, it seems to me that those three reasons should be perfectly adequate for a legal system to operate on, that would be compassionate, that would understand why people end up doing terrible things, and that would help them. And if we legalized all drugs and half the prison population, sorry about that aside, but that's the best way to do it, stop putting people in jail for taking drugs, and we had enough spaces in prisons, the rehabilitation could be really effective. Somebody who's had a really awful life and brought up in such a way, they can't help it, they end up in a gang. They were in this class at school and this happened and they got sucked into that gang. They got made, into the county lines and they were, blah, blah, blah. Maybe we could help to give them a better life in the future. So I think the legal system would work better if it didn't depend on the false concept of free will. And Dan disagrees with me, and we have argued this at great length. Never come to a resolution.
But Dan Dennett goes further, doesn't he? He actually believes free will is compatible with the illusion of consciousness, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And it doesn't make any sense to me, because Dan, I think Consciousness Explained, 1991, his great book on consciousness, I think still the best, certainly one of the best books on consciousness ever. He really goes to town on the nature of the self-illusion, the non-existent audience in the Cartesian theatre. And the basic argument there is, even people who know neuroscience and say they're not dualists, they still imagine some kind of place in the brain or the mind where it all comes together and I have the experience. And this is what he calls the Cartesian theatre, which doesn't exist. And where I see the mental, if I shut my eyes and imagine a green frog, that is my mental screen. Or if I'm looking out here, I'm experiencing this in my inner theatre. Bernie Barr's whole idea of theatre depends on this, and that's another whole argument. So he's brilliant at showing that is an illusion. There isn't anybody in there. So there isn't anybody to have free will.
I don't understand how he argues, because he's one of the best arguers on the planet. Like, how does he argue for a compatibilist argument?
Well, what happens there is to go back to what I was saying at the beginning of talking about free will, which is, to me, you have to separate out the idea of this thing here and the inner self that is an illusion. This isn't an illusion unless everything is, but the inner self is. And he agrees with that distinction. So it is extraordinary to me that, having been, as it were, the greatest persuader that the audience in the Cartesian theatre is an illusion, he won't then say, but free will is part of that illusion. And the way he argues is to keep on saying, well, I could have done otherwise. And in this situation, there was a choice. And this leads me to think that his book, called Freedom Evolves, should really have been called Choice Evolves. I would say, this thing here, not this thing inside that doesn't exist. This thing here makes choices all the time. And when you asked about, well, when this is happening, what's going on? Well, endless choices. The drinking of the wine, the holding of the pen, there's all kinds of massively parallel processes, which he talks about in Consciousness Explained. They are responsible for what actions come out of this mouth and these hands.
It just goes to show how compelling, if even Dan Dennett, the master of arguing us out of our illusion of consciousness, can't accept this. His experience is just too powerful for him to have a look at this.
It's not that. I don't think it's that, because I think his experience is fine, except that he won't take on the job of giving up free will. But I think he keeps conflate, even though he knows there's a separation, difference between the illusory inner self and the whole self. He keeps conflating them and saying, well, these choices are made by this person, and that counts as free will. And that's where he and I differ. He says the free will belongs to the whole person, and I say, no, it doesn't. The free will is always, people attribute it to the inner me. And that's where I think we fall apart, because I can't persuade him that if you really accept the non-existent audience in the Cartesian theatre as the one that's supposed to have the free will, if you say this has the free will, then you're going to say what he says, which is, well, it went into the restaurant and it could have chosen the spaghetti instead of well, that's John Searle who uses that example, but it's a choice. I say we are choice machines. We're endlessly making choices all the time. And in the end, I think he's terrified that the society will fall apart. And I've explained why I don't think it will. Sam Harris explains why he doesn't think it will. Lots of other people have explained why it might not. It would be a big upheaval to change our legal systems, but we'll have to, because they're getting ridiculous. If you think of things like people say, oh, well, I didn't mean to do something or other, my prefrontal cortex, made me do it. You're still inventing this self who would be responsible if their brain hadn't done something. The more neuroscience we learn, the more we're going to have to change our attitude towards law and punishment and so on. And it'll have to happen. It'll be difficult, but it will have to happen. But Dan I shouldn't really speak for him, but I've had a lot of conversations with him, a 6-month back and forward email discussion last year, but also he's been here to my house several times and we've sat over the breakfast and argued about this. And in the end, I think he comes down to he's too afraid of the consequences of people believing it's an illusion. Now, to some extent, there is reason to be cautious about that. It's difficult, but I would rather have the truth, which is that it's illusion, than pretend, because I'm too scared of what the consequences will be.
And your version, which we also touched on in episode 1, listeners, is a version based on compassion and collective responsibility, which I think has to be the way we go in the future, regardless of the status of free will anyway. And hopefully we could, be right in saying that that's the way culture is going. I do hope that taking that positive line is in fact true. Now, you are by no means, Sue, the only one arguing that free will is an illusion. For example, you've just mentioned the philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris, and he has long held, much to the chagrin of everybody around him, and he was very, very brave in holding this for a very long time, that we'd be much, much less frustrated if we realized we didn't have free will. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both of you are long-term meditators. So in your opinion, what is it about the sort of mindfulness meditation approach that helps us to associate less with this feeling that it's ourselves following the trail of thought, the reasoning, and the decision-making? What is it about meditation that makes you sort of less attached to that notion?
It's a long, slow road. As I mentioned earlier, I've been meditating for more than 40 years, every day for 35 years, and going on retreats. And it's slow, but it does seem to be the most extraordinary unfolding process that heads in this kind of direction. So in terms of more straightforward mindfulness meditation, because most of my practice has been in Zen, and that's a more specific kind of way. But for any kind of meditation, letting go is one of the big difficulties. And you have to let go of so much. And a ghastly thought comes and keeps on coming. Let it go doesn't mean push it away. Let it go in meditation means, well, my original Zen teacher, long dead now, John Crook, always used to say, let it come, let it be, let it go. And what he meant by that was, don't block things from coming. When you feel them coming, that awful thought again, I don't want to think about it, don't block it, let it come, let it be. In other words, don't do anything with it, don't hang on to it, cling to it, make something out of it, elaborate it, blah, 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 just let it, whatever. And when it starts to fade away, don't hang on to it, because, that's that terrible thought. And even a terrible one you can hang on to, or a really nice one, of course, it's easier. You want to hang on to it, and I like that. Let it go. So you become, from that very, very simple basic training, sitting there hour after hour after hour with the dredges of your mind coming along, that process of letting go is a fundamental part of most meditation paths. And so when it comes to observing the mind, you see all these thoughts coming up, but you also begin to observe impulses to do things, and you can let them go, or ideas about the control that you have, and you can observe them popping up. And you can, one of the things that I've only realized recently, and this is quite a revelation. I'm saying that in the sense that, you get these revelations in meditation and they seem like, but I don't want to make it that bigger than it is, but it was just something that really surprised me that I should have known already. And I think that's very often the case when you get something in and you go, oh, wow. Yeah, but why didn't I realize that before? What I have found recently is, I suppose, as the mind slows down in deep practice and continuous practice, it's easier and easier to see thoughts popping up and actions and so on. And I've begun to observe much more clearly than I had before the process of attributing a thought to me. So very often I'll now observe that my thinking is, oh, I want to go and do something or other. And I will just realize that that's come up and just let it go in the context of, oh, the universe has thrown that up. This brain has thrown that up. That's what's happening. So instead of me thinking, I want a cup of tea, I'm going in the kitchen to get it. The thought, if there's a thought at all, will be, that's what's happening. She's going into the kitchen to get a cup of tea. So it's allowing the stuff to happen without the attribution. And then you begin to see, like Wegner said, I mean, we go straight back to Wegner's theory, that it's about this false attribution, that it was my thought that caused it. And so then this particular little practice that I've found myself doing recently is simply that, simply seeing the attribution happening and going, oh, there's the attribution happening again. And it all can be attributed to body, brain, in world. It's all just happening. That's bloody terrifying. I mean, it's just happening. And I can't see where it's going to go, what's going to happen. But the reassuring thing is this person has been brought up in a sensible way, can read and write and think straight, and is reasonably moral, tries to be good and kind and compassionate, and let it happen. And that's a matter of confidence and letting it happen. And years and years and years of meditation can help with that actually you are okay and reasonably nice person. And, you do bad things. Everybody does. And, but it's fine to let it happen. And actually it's better to allow it to be the universe doing it than to be constantly thinking about myself. What shall I do now? What am I, did I do the right thing? All of that.
And
sorry, I've gone ranting on. But
no, it was beautifully and it's clearly very, very personal when you're talking about it from inside so many years of meditation. It's very, very personal. And I get the same when I listen to Sam talking about this. Do you guys differ on the free will position, or have you pretty much come to the same conclusion?
I don't know Sam very well. I think I've only met him once. And we've not had big arguments. We've corresponded. I've read his books. I would say we're pretty close. Yes. I mean, his way of putting things over is very different from mine. His attitude to religion is perhaps slightly. I think as far as free will is concerned, I would say we basically would say the same. Yeah.
And would you say he extrapolated, because he started very much in meditation before he came to philosophy and neuroscience? Do you find that there's elements of the meditator mind in the way he's arguing these things?
Oh yeah, absolutely, totally. Well, his books are full of it, aren't they? But
yes. Am I right in saying that the key here is identifying with the self as the source of those ideas, saying that's me talking, that's me reasoning, that's me choosing? Is that the key to this sense of free will, this association with that trail of thought?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what Wegner was on about. I mean, he kept it simpler than that, but that is precisely it. Yes. Every time we make an attribution to ourself of a thought or a decision or an action or whatever, we are giving strength to the illusory self. And we're doing it all the time. And dismantling that is tricky, but worth doing, I would say. I mean, the people I know, and there are not very many, who have let go of the illusion of free will are not, they're great, lovely people, and they're not inhuman. They're not really weird because they've given up free will. You wouldn't really know until you got to know them. I'm only saying that because I'm kind of wanting to reassure people that it's okay. It's tricky. And you do have to have a sense that your intentions are good. But once it gets going, it's a kind of self-propelling process, I think, the letting go.
Now, so I need to ask you about the Zen take on free will, not least because some of my listeners have been asking, saying, oh, Sue, can we get Sue back to talk more about Zen? What's the Zen Buddhist perspective on this? Which, I mean, I imagine you explored it a little bit in your 2011 book, Zen and the Art of Consciousness. What does Buddhism have to say about free will?
Nothing. That's the simple answer is that, because I can only say that because a good friend of mine, Stephen Batchelor, he wrote, some of the viewers will know his books, Buddhism Without Belief, and his other wonderful books. He knows the various languages, Sanskrit and Pali and so on, and says that is no word for free will in those languages in which the original sutras were written down. So that's why I say nothing.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? Not even a word.
It's very, very interesting. Yeah, absolutely it is. So in other words, their way of constructing things was rather different. Nevertheless, there is the fundamental concept of dependent origination or dependent arising within all forms of Buddhism, I think. But I'm not a Buddhist scholar, I must absolutely say that. And almost all my practice has been in Zen, although I've also done training in Mahamudra and in jhanas practice and various other things. But even when it comes to Zen, I know more about practice than I do about theory. So don't take what I'm saying as kind of, a Buddhist scholar saying something they really know about.
Sue, do you mind if I just jump in there? Because this is literally what I was about to ask you about. As you brought it up, I wanted to ask you about this idea of dependent origination, which was the Buddha's second great realization, alongside the first, which is suffering comes from attachment. And the origin of this word dependent origination is that a thing's origin depends on other things, which depend on other things, and so on in an infinite regress, rather than having any identity in itself. So nothing has identity in and of itself, but only interdependent in relation to other things. Now, I had a very interesting mystical experience in my 20s, which, for any listeners interested, I do discuss this with David Luke in our episode on exceptional human experiences. So do go and have a look at that if you're interested in peak experiences. But essentially, this experience showed me that everything was dependently originated. And it was only years later, when I was studying Buddhism at university, that I found this idea. And I learned that it was central to the Buddhist worldview. So given the contents of your mystical experience, which we touched on in episode 1, your extraordinary experience of becoming one with the universe as you couldn't get the right size coming back into your body and you end up expanding until you were one with the universe. Given that extraordinary experience and the reports of so many others and the new research into the relativity of space and time, do you think that this understanding of an inseparable monism could go some way to explain how we can be seemingly separate and yet fundamentally inseparable from the rest of space and time?
Oh, I don't know. But I will say this. I think what the Buddha saw and you saw, I didn't. I mean, mine was a different kind of experience and, amazingly dramatic and very helpful, because I think all my life in a way has been, I was shown that I was just given this amazing experience. And in a way, all my life has been trying to understand that in some way, whether that's meditation or neuroscience or whatever in my life, and that's been great. But I think what the Buddha saw there and that you saw is an absolute fundamental principle that underlies modern science, and that he was, if you like, in a way, the first scientist, the first one to think actually clearly, because all cultures, well, not all, but generally speaking, cultures through all the ages, the natural way that people think about themselves is, from early in childhood, we know now, is to think of themselves as in dualist terms, that there's me inside and I do things and control things. And then, many, many cultures have ideas of spirits and life after death and spirits that do things, and that the rain is there because of a spirit and whatever. And he was basically just cutting through all of that and saying, no, there is no separate self at all. It's not what you think it is. And everything that happens from what was before. And it's not so much, in my understanding, that there's chains of causation. It's more about conditions. They talk about causes and conditions.
Circles of causation, maybe.
Oh, hang on, let's not get to that for a minute. But the basic idea of the conditions, out of these conditions arise this, and out of these conditions arise this, and the entire universe then you can see as everything is interdependent and everything arises because of everything else. That is the way, if I'm thinking about not having free will, that is the way that I'm thinking. Everything is arising as it must, because that's the only way it can, and that's what it's doing, and there isn't any, I couldn't have done otherwise, that's just what happens. So then you said about the circle of well, what's happened as far as I can see in the millennia of Buddhism is that what started out as a fairly straightforward idea with 5 links, I think, of things giving rise to things giving rise to things, became elaborated. People do love this. They do now. There's a 12 link thing. And I recently I've become interested in dependent origination, but I've always thought, what a load of crap. This gives rise to this and this gives rise, and it goes around, and there's 12 of them. Why should there be 12? And, I just think, sorry, this is me being childish, if you like, but I've never wanted to know about that. I just think it's like so much stuff, for example, in the Abhidharma and elsewhere, which you can just look at it and think that's just people making stuff up, trying to make sense out of it. So I ignore all that stuff, and that's why I keep saying I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I don't know all that stuff, and I'm probably missing out on the most fantastic things, but I'm much more interested in just getting on with seeing clearly and meditating in order to do so.
I didn't go into the details, Sue, of all of the, what I would call basically theological, obviously it's the Buddhist version, but all of those Buddhist scholars who went on shortly after the Buddha died. It immediately became a massive argument, and everybody was going into the cosmologies based on these ideas. But I think the Buddha literally just saw it, and that was it.
Yeah.
It wasn't like
absolutely right. And he said, when people asked him questions about, does the universe last forever or does it stop, or those kind of questions, he said, I'm not going to answer them.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And now he might, I don't know if he were like, well, there probably are enlightened people around and now who might look at the physics and go, yeah, that makes sense, or doesn't, or whatever. But, he was very sensibly saying, this is how I see it. And it's actually easy to see if you look in the right way at anything. You can just see. I think, no, it's not easy. That's wrong. But let's suppose you can simplify your response to the world. I suppose I've shut my eyes because that immediately makes it simpler, but it's possible with the eyes open as well. And simply experience what's happening without words, without conceptualization, without making objects of things. It's amazingly hard to do. I shouldn't have implied that it's at all easy, but in principle, it's straightforward. What you find is it's pretty gappy. There's just little bits and pieces, and noise here or whatever. We immediately make space. I think we can't avoid that, although I think it may be possible. But, this whatever the sound is over there, and this bottom sitting on this stool is here. Our whole brain is set up to do spatial awareness. But even if you're still doing that, that noise doesn't have to be the fire crackling over there. You don't, what your brain is doing for obvious reasons for you to live in the world and get on with stuff is, oh, that's the fire. Oh, was that a car outside? Or, oh, is that my husband coming and saying it's supper time? Or, whatever. Then, but it's possible simply to sit there and there's just kind of sights and sounds and whatever, and they have no meaning at all once all the words and conceptualizations have gone away. Then it's pretty obvious that it all just happens because it has to happen. And it's not objects. The objects, this laptop in front of me, this pen, I need to be able to say that's a pen, and I need to be able to write with it. So that's the way my brain is working. But give it a chance.
The reason I mentioned this idea of an inseparable monism, listeners, in our first episode, we discussed briefly the different positions on potential theories of consciousness, and Sue said that she really wanted to try and find a monist solution. You know, dualism really is problematic. You've got the whole combination problem, and it just really isn't where you want to end up. And the reason I mentioned dependent origination is because, for me personally, sitting inside that experience of it, I really felt that it was possible to have a scientific explanation for how some things could appear to give rise to others, but within a network rather than a linear line, within a network of interconnected causation.
Yeah.
That basically talks about a monism. So you've got separateness within a monism, and that doesn't cause any problems. And the only reason I find this so exciting now is that physics seem to be heading this direction. The implications of Einstein, which we're going to be getting into on the show, listeners, really are still a bit like the free will question. They're terrifying. You know, you're like, oh my God, what do you mean that time isn't real? And one of the most amazing implications of dependent origination is not only that all things in space are interconnected in causation, but also all moments in time. That's from the beginning to the end. So the very first moment in time is as dependent on the last moment in time as everything else. But Einstein's theory may well explain to us that time and space are an illusion anyway. So with that in mind, I'm finally finding some peace with this idea of a two-tiered reality where we have separateness and we have oneness. And I think dependent origination, for me personally, with that experience, was the sort of bridge. Have you had anything similar, Sue? Anything that kind of made you feel that there was a connection between separateness and oneness?
Yes, but in the end, I don't get it. I still don't get how there can be experience and what underlies it all, because it seems absolutely obvious that there is only experience. There's nothing else. I mean, I can't, even a physicist with their instruments, that reading the things and so on. It's all based on that. So why do we agree that there's a world out there? What is the fundamental underlying nature? I come then back to form and emptiness, that form, everything that we experience comes out of nothing. And that nothingness can be directly experienced as nothingness. There's nothing you can say about it. But how does that work? I mean, to me...
And why do you fall on the side of... Sue, why do you fall on the side of nothingness rather than everythingness? You say
I don't. I'm just saying that's the Buddhist concept of form and emptiness. That actually they're the same in the end. Form. I mean, in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Form is precisely emptiness and emptiness is precisely form. So also are sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. That much seems clear, and then because then you find that in this moment, well, if you really get into it, you can never find a moment. But if I allow there to be one in experience, where's that come from? Out of nowhere. No, I like mystery. I don't know whether if you noticed if you've seen my big consciousness textbook, it begins with perplexity. Get perplexed about this. It really is bad. And if you think it's bad, it's probably even worse than you think it is. And at the end, it ends with a little cartoon of someone saying, but what is it? And it ends with perplexity. Because I don't think, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I even agree with you that those are really interesting ways that physics is going. Doesn't solve the mystery to me. I'm still bewildered.
Yet
that bewilderment pushes you on to try and keep going, and I'm trying and keeping going. I'm wondering, being perplexed.
And Sue, something you said in the first episode has come up really quite often, about this don't know mind, this ability to study consciousness from this desire not to get into isms, because as soon as we associate with a mental construct, we are constricted by human thought, which unfortunately isn't capable, even at its highest level, of understanding anything so complete from our one-sided perspective. So I think it made me laugh when you said, I don't get it, because it's almost like, hang on, haven't you been saying there's nothing to get,
Oh, well, if you end up with me looking like utterly confused, that's fine by me.
It means we've had a good old chew of the gristle if we get to that I don't get it moment.
Yeah. Well, I expect we'll have another one in due course. At least, sorry, I should perhaps not invite myself, but it is fun talking to you. And
well, it's very kind of you to be so enthusiastic. So I wanted to thank you for taking a punt on the podcast before we were even existent and just saying, yeah, let's go for it. It was really, really sweet of you. And I'm very, very touched for you to say that it's exciting to talk to me, because I'm such an amateur, and it just feels wonderful to have one's thoughts and perspectives and ideas validated by such a seasoned professional. And I have to say, Sue, I am going to ask you back for season 3, because we still haven't had the chance to talk about possibly one of the most important things of your work, which is memetics, which you tackled in your 2010 book, The Meme Machine. So I really hope you won't mind coming back.
1999.
Oh, right. Okay, right. Yeah. Sorry, I've got that wrong. Of course, it's 1999. Gosh, that has been a long time since you wrote that, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm getting back into that stuff now, so I'll happily talk about it.
It's so relevant now with all of the information ecology that's going on, and all of this wonderful, the media going independent. I mean, obviously there are lots and lots of challenges, and I think your work really is a useful kind of, it's almost like a tool, a sort of like, don't forget this while you're navigating all of this information. So I really want you to come back and talk about this, the way we pick up these memes that seem to confirm our biases, and then we retransmit them out into the world, sometimes completely unconsciously. I really wouldn't ask if I didn't think it was more relevant than ever to myself and to the listeners to get aware of that. And I'm sure that the research has come a long way since you wrote that book. So, Sue, it leaves me only to say thank you so much. Just back from a retreat, coming on the show to explain this really, really, really difficult argument, ancient argument to the listeners, and helping us really put ourselves on the spot and say, listen, do we want to really live with this one? Or are we going to do what so many do and just say, well, let's do it as if we had free will. I really don't know where I stand. I don't get it either. I have no idea. I'm just going to leave it like that. I think it's great. Sue, you've really helped me to just be like, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. And I think for somebody like yourself who's been pursuing those big questions from the start, it's actually a great relief, because the kind of tormented philosopher really is just so pointless when you realize how much of this is just pure hot air. You're suffering unnecessarily. Would you agree? Yeah.
But maybe you have to go through that to come to something else.
Absolutely.
Right. Till next time.
Thank you so much, Sue. See you next time.
Bye.